Good evening to you all. It's a wonderful honor to see you here. My name is Warren von Eschenbach. I'm the academic director here, and it gives me great pleasure on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of the University of Notre Dame to welcome you to the 4th annual Shakespeare lecture in honor of Professor Stanley Wells. It's a real treat that we have Dominic Dromgoole here with us from the Globe to deliver tonight's lecture, which I think will be as engaging and riveting as the previous lectures. For those of you who are with us for the first time, I'd like to extend a special note of gratitude for your presence and to welcome you to the Notre Dame London Global Gateway, which is the university's largest presence outside of its main campus in the United States in northern Indiana. Our relationship with London, our presence in London, goes back to the 1970s, when our law school started a program for its postgraduate students, which was followed about a decade later by our undergraduate program, which is a general studies curriculum for students to come from the main campus to study here in London. As you may expect, unsurprisingly, this is now one of the most popular destinations for our students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, and we educate more than 400 students across several programs, multidisciplinary programs, annually. As part of the university's internationalization efforts, we are transforming, or trying to transform, where we've had these presents for undergraduate and a few academic programs into what the university is calling global gateways, which are really just a venue for intellectual and cultural exchange where we can bring a little bit of Notre Dame to the world and the world to Notre Dame. The goal primarily is to help enrich our students' experience intellectually, but also help foster and extend our faculty's scholarship and research. And we now in London at least do host more than 100 events each year, anything from book launches to seminars to major conferences and lectures such as this tonight. I think, though, however, tonight's lecture and this lecture series in particular, thanks to the support and hard work of many people in this room, has become our signature annual event. And it's such a great honor and privilege for us to be able to host this lecture. And I'd like to just take a couple more minutes and just thank a few people. There are many more, but I just would like to acknowledge a few people who have been involved. Most importantly, our co-sponsors of this event, our friends at the Shakespeare Institute, and John Jowett is here with us this evening. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust and Paul Edmondson, thank you for being here once again. And especially to Professor Wells for your commitment and for your partnership to make this lecture series happen. It's a wonderful, wonderful honor for us. I also like to acknowledge some colleagues on campus who are behind the scenes and a little bit out front as well, who support our efforts. Most especially Peter Holland, who many of you know, Scott Jackson, who's the executive director of Shakespeare in Notre Dame, and also my predecessor, Greg Kusich, for the work that they have done in making this series possible. Finally, I would like to give expression of personal gratitude and my deep respect to Boyka Sokolova for her work. Without her, this lecture would not happen. She's really kind of the heart and soul of what happens, all things Shakespeare, at the London Global Gateway. And I'd like to invite her up to introduce tonight's speaker. So thank you very much.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure having you all here for the 4th annual Shakespeare lecture in honor of Stanley Wells. Our distinguished guest tonight is well known to many in this room, but it is in the nature of the event for somebody to say a few words. It is my part and great pleasure to say a few words about Dominic. Dominic Dromgoole was appointed artistic director of Shakespeare's Globe in 2006. 10 years later, as he's stepping down, he's leaving an institution firmly established on the theatre skyline of London. Dominic's obvious great achievement during this decade is the sustained high level of production at the Globe. While he himself regularly directs, he has also opened the stage to talented directors who have brought inventiveness, character, and verve. As a person interested in how women fare in the theatre, I'm impressed by the opportunity they have been given during Dominic's time. Established and young female directors have given the Globe some of its most exciting, iconic performances. To mention just two, for example, Lucy Bailey's blood-curdling Titus Andronicus and Thea Sharrock's wonderfully joyful As You Like It. Under Dominic, the Globe's repertory opened up beyond Shakespeare and his contemporaries to both new plays and creatively reimagined Greek classics. The theatre is also looking forward to the future through its rich program of broadcasts, DVDs, and streaming online. For me, as for many others, a star moment in the theatre's history came during the 2012 Olympics, when 36 foreign companies performed one play of the canon, each in their native language, the 37th being done by the Globe. This genuinely globe-to-globe event brought to London various visions of Shakespeare and audiences from different diasporas, to many of whom Shakespeare spoke for the first time in their own language in London. Sometimes the atmosphere of festive celebration was so overwhelming with communal spirit that one felt present at a moment stretching back to the very birth of theatre. Last year, a new globe-linked space came into being, the jewel-like Sam Wanamaker Theatre, which opened with Dominic's production of The Duchess of Malfi, performed not under the stars, but in the magic ambience created by candlelight. Throughout this period of transformation and growth, Dominic hasn't stopped directing. He has done about a dozen productions for the Globe alone, starting with Coriolanus in 2006, and ending with a production I very much look forward to see, Measure for Measure, a play riddled with the ambiguities surrounding a reign. It's an appropriate choice, perhaps, for the end of a phase in a director's career, and my feeling is that whatever note Dominic chooses to end his production on, when it comes to assessing his time at the helm of the Globe, critics will unambiguously define it as a happy period. As a second phase of the Globe-to-Globe program, the Globe is now itself traveling around the world, and I mean the world, all capitals. Dominic's production of Hamlet is on a royal progress, aiming at visiting every country on the map. Yesterday, I looked it up on their website, and you can do the same to see how far they've got. Yesterday, they were playing in Brazzaville. Today, they're traveling to Johannesburg. I caught up with them in Gdansk at the opening of the Gdansk Shakespeare Theatre, built like the Globe, near the site of an old structure where English players used to perform in the 17th century. It is about the experience of Shakespeare around the world that Dominic is going to talk to us today. It is hard to imagine a better person to deliver a round and varnished tale of travel, Shakespeare, and traveling with Shakespeare. And we all look forward to hearing it. Dominic.
Thank you for those exceptionally kind words. And I'd just like to say what an honour it is to be here at an evening in honour of Stanley, a great Shakespearean. We've achieved a number of things at the Globe over the last 10 years, but I do want to speak tonight about touring broadly around the UK and touring around Europe. Our touring adventure at the New Globe began one late April day in 2007. It began with a bit of colossal organisational clumsiness and then a rather magnificent gesture to cope with that clumsiness. Our first small-scale tour we ever did was to be Romeo and Juliet, and the director and designer had created the 8-person actor-musician show around that perennial style icon of travel, the Volkswagen camper van. It was a delightful conceit, and the rehearsals proved to work with wit and with articulacy. However, a few days before we were about to open, a rather substantial snag appeared. There was no aperture around the globe, no doorway, no gate, no lift large enough to admit this vehicle. The van couldn't get in. There was no show without the van. We considered cancelling the show until an outlandish solution was proffered up. So for that one day, we hired an enormous industrial crane and lifted the camper van up out of our car park high into the sky, then lowered it in through the empty roof of the Globe. Ridiculous as it was, looking magnificent and silly at the same time, this ritualistic lowering of a vehicle into the great thatch moor of the Globe proved a wonderfully symbolic and emphatic beginning to what has proved an incredible adventure. What began that day at the Globe is now traversing the world. What were we up to? Why tour Shakespeare? Why were we risking the dignity of a frequently patronised but greatly loved institution with this new endeavour? First, of course, we were filling a hole. Touring Shakespeare has been a continuous tradition since the plays were written. These plays were made for walking, not for sitting at home. They're made so that they could go out and reach people, not so they could stay immured in palaces of culture. For centuries, this tradition had been continued and extended, but when we began this venture, the tradition was withering on the vine. The RSC had chosen to justify its enormous subsidy by drawing in its horns and dumping a rather glorious tradition of improvised small-scale school hall whenever and wherever touring, as well as a lot of its large-scale touring, in the process rather casually dumping that audience without so much as a goodbye note left on the kitchen table. Hope there's no RSC people here. It's surprising how often subsidy seems to be about protecting artists from the audience rather than engaging with them. The Arts Council, in their perennial hopeless muddle about whether to be culture leaders or culture providers, traditionalists or avant-gardists, had deprioritised their support for touring Shakespeare. So the hole was there which needed to be filled. And it's important to remember that these holes are not empty lumps of dull concrete, not just municipal theatres that have to be filled with lumpen product, nor are they gaps in marketing brochures, nor are they worrying deficits in budgets. Touring Shakespeare is not about fulfilling a state duty. These are holes in the stomachs of people, in the people from a culture who've grown up with an appetite for the unique food that Shakespeare provides. We didn't know the audience were there until we went out and met them, but the evidence of their hunger in terms of numbers and satisfaction once we started touring was undeniable. The other hole was probably in further fulfilling the Globe's own mission. The achievements of Mark Rylance, my predecessor as artistic director, in wrestling the Globe into life as a performance venue will always dwarf the achievements of any others connected with the building. But the sheer effort of making the building sing, as he did, left much that he would have liked to have achieved left undone. And the Globe's mission, which is always an odd conglomeration of what the Globe did 400 years ago, what Sam Wanamaker left behind as a sense of mission, and what any passing artistic director chooses to nominate, has always been primarily about spreading the word beyond the polygonal enclosure of the building itself. It used to be the Ladybird book axiom that the early modern acting companies upped sticks and left London to go on the road because of the plague. The axiom being that whenever the plague hit London hard, the theatres shut down and the Lord Chamberlain's men went walking. That and the rage and contempt of the city fathers. There's an undeniable truth in both, but there is now ample evidence that touring carried on when the London theatres were open and they were healthy, and that the companies ran an extensive touring programme alongside their building-based work. Why? First, money. There was an audience out there of hungry citizens unable to come to London and wealthy parochial patrons desperate to impress their client networks and their posh neighbours with the shows they could sponsor and present. Money and making it is one of the most important original practices of all. In our day and age, full of shyly presented outreach programmes, frequently so stuffed with a sense of virtue and condescending good works that mischief and fun, the motors of all good drama, hardly get a look in, and with our general expectation funded by an appalling snob centralisation of artistic legitimacy that anybody who plays in Barnstaple deserves a medal, In this day and age, it's impossible to wrap our head around the earth-shattering confidence and desire with which these companies would travel. They didn't arrive timidly in the hope that an audience might show up. They kicked the door down, saying, "We're here." Secondly, and more importantly, touring was in these people's blood. It's important to remember that for a couple of 100 years, British theatre was touring, and touring was British theatre. The great fun palaces built in London in the 1570s and the 1580s were the Johnny-come-lately edifices within a culture which for centuries had improvised stage realities, conjuring up Christian ritual, ancient Rome, British history, in the courtyards of inns, on booth stages in market squares, at one end of a guild hall, in a university dining room, and wherever else they could. Theatres were made not from wood and brick and plaster, but from the collective imagination and willpower of actors and audiences. Shakespeare's own company were a touring company before they found a home. The young Shakespeare himself was no doubt ushered to the front of the audience by his proud alderman father in Stratford's Guildhall to watch the touring product of his day. And it could well have been something in one of those performances, some stray gesture of magical unlocking, an actor looking deep into his eyes with their perennial promiscuous connection, intoning some thumping old lump of Tudor poetry, some incident like that, which first ignited the desire to make theatre within the young William. And his first experience of making it was quite probably after hitching a ride with a touring company and feeling the insane freedom which life on the road can afford. And this is another of the central facts about touring. Touring is a blast. That is the single reason why touring began, continued, and still continues, and it's the one reason you won't find in any number of books about the theatre of Shakespeare's day. Touring is top fun. Theatre has become so oddly defensive as a business, almost always having to defend itself from the depredations of pundits and critics, always looking to find virtuous and socio-political reasons to justify its own existence, that it often forgets to mention the principal reason why people want to get involved in the first place. It's the best time that you can have without drugs, and often better with drugs. Touring only sharpens the pleasures that the life in the theatre naturally affords. The sense of fleeting connection, families created that are intense and short-lived, and all the more intense for the shortness of their life. The outlaw pleasure of trucking into a place, painting the landscape around you in new and surprising colours, gifting a story and some laughter and some new thought to a community, enjoying the surprising ease of access into both shebeen at one hand and palace at the other, and then getting out of there so fast before the ties of responsibility or the heavy hand of the law catch up with you. When Shakespeare has Hamlet greet the tragedians of the city into the narrative of his own world, he's setting off an enormous series of chimes for his audience and in self-reflexive fashion for the author. The play they perform, written in truly appalling verse, may be deeply clonky. And just to digress for a second, isn't it a beautiful Shakespearean paradox that probably the greatest talker ever created in any drama is also a truly appalling writer? It's always richly amusing to me in contemporary productions to see people trying to dignify Hamlet's clumsy letter to Ophelia into a naive sincerity, or invest the eye-wateringly bad verse of the play which Hamlet has penned with a deep seriousness. Not only is this indicative of the central daftness of our contemporary culture, where an assertive and coercive glumness is frequently used to confer a fake dignity on art, but it also misses the point of the play and the character entirely. Hamlet can speak as well as he does, with his bright, Mozartian, glittering, improvised freedom, precisely because he can't write for toffee. It's also a delightful meta-theatrical joke that our author Shakespeare can write a great talker, Hamlet, who can't write a word. But anyway, though the play is terrible, the freedom with which the players blow through the cold stone world of Elsinore offers a tantalizing glimpse for Hamlet and for us of a better way of life. They are free to come into this world with noise and joy, free to make friendships, free to make frustratingly real connections with their own phony feelings, where Hamlet cannot connect with his own real ones, free to cock a snook at the court in a play that says much that the court has been unable to say, free to speak truth to power, if a little obliquely, and then crucially, free to go. And it's crucial to remember that the freedom afforded by touring didn't simply apply to moving around the UK in Shakespeare's day, but further afield as well. It still seems extraordinary to me that we accept the internationalism of Shakespeare as a commonplace, but assume it's a modern development. In fact, it's as old as the plays themselves. Much has been made now of the now iconic performance of Hamlet on board the Dragon off the coast of Sierra Leone in 1608. The crew, many of whom had no doubt seen the show at the Globe, and using the extraordinary mnemonic capacity of their age, remembered enough of the play to shamble a show together for a group of visiting dignitaries from the African mainland. Many people, including us, happily blazon this fact, while falling strangely mute about the shadow that falls across that moment. The Dragon was one of the first ships of the East India Company. The alliance of Shakespeare, probably the greatest single soft power influence of all time, with the great-grandfather of all psychopathic corporations, is a distinctly uneasy one. However, the uneasy historical ripples thrown out by this incident are quashed by the extraordinary freedom with which these plays travelled elsewhere beyond the English Channel. Had this been the only instance of Hamlet moving around, it would be justifiable to raise more than an eyebrow. But in fact, Hamlet was quite quickly all over the European shop. Shakespeare wrote and made theatre not just for Merry England, but for a huge and important European audience accessed through touring. His and his colleagues' approach to this new market was deliberate, systematic, and an enormous part of the London theatre scene in the 16th century. We know of as many as 100 actors who were permanently employed across Europe during this period, either acting alone, travelling with companies, or joining local companies throughout Scandinavia, the Netherlands, northern Germany, Austria, Bohemia, and the Baltics. The list of actors who worked abroad is a distinguished one, including Ben Jonson, and from Shakespeare's company, Will Kemp, George Bryan, and Thomas Pope. What drove them all to seek pastures new? Sometimes they were simply told to. The Earl of Leicester's men accompanied their patron on his progress through Utrecht, Leyden, and The Hague, when the Earl was appointed commander of the English troops in the Netherlands. Frequently, it was because they could make more money abroad than they could at home. From what we can surmise, the kind of theatre presented in a German market square would have been fairly distinct from what was presented on the Globe stage. The companies of English actors that roamed Northern Europe were known collectively as the comedians of England, which gives us a broad clue as to the nature of their playing style. There is evidence that the plays were substantially cut and that broad farce, music, and gymnastic feats were highlighted over delicate psychological acting. Hamlet would probably have run at about an hour, no great loss, with an extended dumb show and with incidents like the killing of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern acted out rather than reported on. The kings of the company were the clowns, who had to be bilingual so that they could crack a couple of jokes in the native tongue and bridge complicated narrative jumps with a little straightforward storytelling. The English actors were popular, they say, because of their quality of their action and their gesture. The English plays were popular because the London theatres of the time, much like the Hollywood of today, were massively successful play factories, churning out thrilling history after lurid bloodbath, after psychological thriller, after rom-com sex farce. One German noble, Landgrave Maurice from Hesse-Kassel, they don't make titles like that anymore, was so enamoured of the English theatre that he kept his own company of English performers. They toured around under his patronage and played in a theatre he had specially built for them. Landgrave Maurice even travelled to London to commission new plays from English writers. I think we can now consider Prince Hamlet and his joy at the arrival of the players in Denmark in a new light. The scenes around the play within the play are not only a celebration of the playfulness and ingenuity of the title hero, but also of his internationalism. It may be a great disappointment to UKIP fans to learn that the culture of Shakespeare's London was energetically, enthusiastically European. It may be a disappointment to the cultural commissars of the left who sneer at tourists at our present-day Globe to realise that audiences and plays travelled both ways even then. But for us, when we play in Washington or Shanghai or Gdansk, it's delightful to know that we're fulfilling an artistic compulsion as old as the plays themselves. So, how did it go for us at the start on our touring? Well, without doubt, it was a mixed bag. There were some notably sticky moments. Playing in the middle of a housing estate in Middlesbrough, one large family took spirited exception to the appearance of Shakespeare in their midst and rained down a volley of abuse on the show. Much of the rest of the audience took exception to their taking exception, and a small riot ensued. I asked our producer the next day how the show went, and she said, fine once the police turned up. The police actually turning up on horseback and chasing the difficult family around the estate. It's got to be a first, that. There was a moment in Liverpool where we were playing Winter's Tale, including my wife, who's sitting there in the audience, in the valley under their old cathedral with a sheer rise up on the other side, up to a popular road. This gave a group of scallies an ideal vantage point from which to rain down small rocks, both on show and audience, necessitating a temporary evacuation of the stage until front of house could climb up the hill and scream abuse at them. But beside that, there were clear glories. The sheer joy of playing Hamlet in the wild 1930s dottiness of the Minack in Cornwall, before 800 people seemingly piled up on top of each other up that cliff face as the English Channel crashes into the jagged Cornish shore below, takes a lot of beating. Sheer historical delight of playing in the quad of the Bodleian Library, with James I looking on spectrally from one side and the Earl of Pembroke looking sternly from the other, takes some beating. The great reward of playing the beautiful Theatre Royal in Margate, one of the oldest operating theatres in the country, which is a delight to play in for the beauty of the theatre itself, but also because the tickets are all held at £8 and £10. People from that area, many of them don't have the money to get anywhere near London, and their pleasure and their appetite for seeing the show and for tasting that flavour, which they can't find anywhere else, again, takes a lot of beating. And I remember one specific moment at Leeds Castle down in Kent, on our first tour of Romeo and Juliet, when we travelled down and found with delight an audience of 500 or 600 laid out on the grass, picnics, champagne and beer spread out around them, the shrieking peacocks competing with the actors for attention, the wind rustling through the wood behind the stage, and the light slowly vacating the space as the focus closed in inexorably on the young lover's story, and the held breath of the audience tightened the air around us all. And that was the moment, I think, when I thought, hello, we might be onto something here. And then just to provide a longer example of the delights and the downside of each touring, there was our scarred into our memories experience of the 3 Henry VI plays climaxing in what we know as the madness of Barnet, or often we just say Barnet and we know what we're talking about. When the director Nick Bagnall told us he wanted to direct Henry VI Part 3, I said, no, you have to do all 3. And then later, after a moment of mad inspiration in the shower, I announced, and you have to take all 3 plays to the sites where the battles took place. So we did. As well as touring indoor and outdoor venues throughout the UK, the 3 plays were performed that summer over 4 one-day events on 4 of the original battle sites from the plays: Towton, Tewkesbury, St Albans and Barnet. Battle of Towton was the bloodiest battle ever fought in England, with over 28,000 civilians and soldiers dying over one day in March 1461. This was our first stop on the battlefield tour. In 1461, the battle took place in a snowstorm. For us, the sun shone, the audience arrived, and the first play of the trilogy, Harry VI, went up. All was going beautifully. The actors were doing justice to the play. The local audience had come out to claim their own history. Several people had turned up in various sorts of authentic costuming. A BBC reporter nervously asked one gentleman if his large, flat grey spade of a beard was a Wars of the Roses beard, and he was quickly and firmly corrected. No, it's more 1350s, actually. We began the tragedy of the Duke of York, the last play, where Shakespeare depicts the Battle of Towton in clear skies. At the very first mention of Towton, one of nature's weird acts of artistic collaboration took place. Almost literally on the word Towton, the sun in its setting suddenly shot great arcs of red and pink and purple along ridges of broken cloud. In panoramic sympathy, the ending of the day was matching the ending of the play, and summoning up a sharp reminder of the ending of so many young lives in the snow 650 years before. Actors and audience caught their breaths for a prolonged moment. St Albans was the site of our penultimate battlefield performance. The set stood in front of the imposing Gothic cathedral, a place of worship for over 1700 years. You could almost touch the presence of those who had fought and died there. The mighty Gloucester, depicted in the plays, is buried in a crypt within the cathedral, and after his play death, he was carried out on a bier through the great oak doors, the history and the play and the present dancing uneasily together. Spirits seemed to glide between the nave of the abbey and the towers of the set, menacingly teasing those who performed beneath it. But that was nothing to Barnet. We went to survey the final site, the very field where the decisive Battle of Barnet took place in 1471, a few weeks before the performance. The whole event was going to be filmed and live streamed for the BBC's cultural website, The Space, with experimental cameras embedded in the stage and a drone taking aerial shots of the performance. We approached through suburban roads named Tudor, Plantagenet and Warwick, and ambled to a clearing in the middle of a wooded area known as Monken Hadley Common, trying to decide on the best spot for the stage and where the cameras should go. Though now situated in leafy suburbia, this spot had been another site of our internecine carnage. As we wandered, we noticed a large rising puff of smoke coming from a patch of grass in the middle of the clearing. Not enough to worry over. Then there's another one, this time near the trees where we had entered the clearing, and another cloud in miniature, close to where we were standing. Puffball mushrooms maybe, but there were no mushrooms, no animals, not even a steaming pile of dog poo. We discussed what could have produced the mystery smoke for 5 minutes or so, then the conversation moved on, and so did we. Then on to the day of performance, the Saturday of a bank holiday weekend. Were any of you there? No, good. It's 8 a.m. and it's pouring with rain. The weather forecast does not look good. Weather forecasts are always wrong. It'll clear up soon, we say. 40 volunteer stewards arrive and huddle under our box office marquee. The company of actors excitedly appear on site and look around them and up at the sky. Can't go on all day. It'll clear up soon. At 11 a.m, the audience begin to arrive with their fold-up chairs, picnic hampers, and rain mats. They look hopeful and expectant. The set's an imposing construction made of towers of steel and ladders all raised up on steel decking, standing in front of 2 oak trees, arching over the set, that look like they could have arched over the original battle 500 years ago. All could be wonderful, but it rains, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains, and it rains. Harry VI begins. The rain pours on the coffin of Henry V. The stage is a sheen of wet. The actors stride across the stage, each one of us fearful that the king will slip, the queen will tumble, the bishop will fall. The perfect sound system captures every line uttered, every beat of the drums. It also captures the remorseless, hammering rain. The actors throw their voices more and more loudly as the storm shouts louder back. Harry VI's royal robe glows blacker, wetter, heavier. It all has, at least, a certain battlefield authenticity. The drone is grounded. Its wings as sodden as a mayfly's in a storm. No aerial shots today. The crusade against wind and rain continues. We're assured by the Met Office that it's going to clear up at any minute, but the rain pours and continues to pour. By this point, the director is looking nervous, the actors are looking mutinous. Someone is really going to hurt themselves, they say. The actors wring out their costumes and stage management mop the stage. The second play, The Houses of York and Lancaster, begins. Swords land dangerously as legs slide awkwardly, and the rain continues to beat upon us, and still we fail to take the hint. The sky darkens, the weather worsens, but we're into The Tragedy of the Duke of York, the last play. Something demented, hallucinatory, and strangely British is taking place. Where else in the world would 400 people stay in the sodden wet in 11 hours of continual, without break, pouring rain to watch 10 hours of ancient drama recounting more ancient history? The commitment of the actors and the audience alike has gone beyond pluck to something madder, rawer, wilder, and more wonderful. It's the great British determination to do something totally at odds with common sense, purely because they have said they would. But Barnet still has one surprise in store. At the moment that Warwick announces, "I will away towards Barnet presently," blackout. There is a burst of grey smoke billowing out of the top of the generator, then silence. All the stage lights have gone, leaving only the TV camera's floodlights frontlighting the actors in Grand Guignol ghostly monochrome. A wind spins violently around the clearing, and filming equipment crashes to the ground as umbrellas seem to start attacking the audience. Every single light indicating the way into or out of the site is gone. Box office, catering tent, and backstage are plunged in darkness. It feels as if the now liquid earth could suddenly open up beneath the clearing, and burial pits could belch up old warriors. Henry VI is alone on his knees in the middle of the wet and gloomy stage, with rain darkening his robe as he proclaims, "God forgive my sins and pardon thee." We were all hard pushed not to join in. Part of the pleasure of presenting Shakespeare on the road is, of course, the treasure trove of such adventure stories which the process affords, and theatre companies always feel further validated by the extraordinary. It's not an art form which lends itself to being normal. Yet there are, of course, further reasons for us touring in this way. Part of our endeavour has, of course, been about trying to bust Shakespeare out of the orthodoxies of how he should be done and how not. Shakespeare wrote for the beautifully rough and simultaneously sophisticated instrument of the great globe for a large part of his life, and towards the end of his life with an eye to the indoor theatres and to the new storytelling and technological advances that they afforded. But he also, no doubt, had a constant memory of the older forms of storytelling within which he began his own work, as well as a weather eye on all of the touring productions, which were no doubt going on and which he knew about. The text for our international Hamlet is one deeply informed by the first, or bad, quarto. There are several theories about how this mongrel piece of work came into being. One is that someone had simply heard the play in performance and then recited it to a printer. This is hard to credit. The gigabyte capacity of your average Elizabethan's memory was certainly far in advance of that of a modern auditor, but even so, this seems to be stretching it a bit. The other is that it was recollected by the actor who first played Marcellus. This seems more trustworthy, given most of Marcellus's lines are remembered much more soundly than the others, and that this character also becomes strangely ubiquitous towards the end of the play, when usually he's absent. My feeling about the provenance of this text was always informed by the not-so-subtle clue presented on the frontispiece of the quarto. It says fairly unequivocally, "As it hath been divers times acted by his Highness's servants in the city of London, as also in the two universities of Cambridge and Oxford, and elsewhere." This is surely a touring text. And touring for millennia meant one thing: shorter plays. This text is half the length of the others. Actors carry lines like baggage. They are heavy. Offer a group of actors a play of 4,000 lines to take on a long tour with a small company, and their response is liable to be brutal and simple. Negotiations will then ensue, some sanctioned by the author, some illegitimate amongst the company, about how to cut and shape a quicker and briefer version. As well as the frontispiece, there are clues within the text. At the end, with Hamlet dead and Fortinbras having entered to take over the kingdom, Horatio is the only principal character left around to report what has occurred, a task which Hamlet nervously begs him to do properly with almost his dying breath. In versions 2 and 3, the second quarto and the folio, he says, "Give order that these bodies high on a stage be placed to the view, and let me speak to the yet unknowing world how these things came about." In the first, bad quarto, he says, "Content yourselves. I'll show to all the ground the first beginning of this tragedy. Let there a scaffold be reared up in the marketplace, and let the state of the world be there." A scaffold in the marketplace. The first seems to clearly reference a theatre in a room, the second one more improvised and temporary. This act, setting up a stage in the marketplace, is the exact description of how touring companies operated, the booth stage mode, which we had adapted for our small-scale touring. There's a cruder, bolder energy to this text. Claudius is more of an old-fashioned villain, less of a politician. He and others are drawn in primary colours. Swathes of philosophical musing are excised. Complex plot junctures are barged through. There are melodramatic flourishes. Claudius's prayer for redemption ends, "No king on earth is safe if God's his foe." It's easy to imagine that line being said with an appropriate glare to awe the groundlings in the marketplace. It's also not hard to perceive the difficulty of saying something so incendiary in the middle of London. maybe it was possible to be a little more radical on the road. It's easy to be patronising and dismissive of this sort of writing, and it has to be said that there is some outright rubbish in this text. Quite a lot of it is eye-wateringly bad. Where Hamlet's most famous line runs, "To be or not to be, that is the question," in the first quarto, it fairly pathetically runs, "To be or not to be, aye, there's the point." Some people have tried to justify the directness of even this line, which is taking revisionism a little too far. It's just plain bad. But there are also glories in the first quarto, which contradict the theory that Shakespeare had nothing to do with it. At the end of the speech instruction to the players, there is a passage to the comedians which contains some of Shakespeare's or anyone's finest writing about comedy. "Let not your clown speak more than is set down. There be of them, I can tell you, that will laugh themselves to set on some quantity of barren spectators to laugh with them. Albeit there is some necessary point in the play then to be observed. Oh, 'tis vile, and shows a pitiful ambition in the fool that useth it. And then you have some again that keeps one suit of jests, as a man is known by one suit of apparel, and, gentlemen, quotes his jests down in their tables before they come to the play, as thus: Cannot you stay till I eat my porridge? Or, you owe me a quarter's wages, and your beer is sour. And blubbering with his lips when God knows, the warm clown cannot make a jest unless by chance, as the blind man catches a hare. Masters, tell him of it." This is a prescription against catchphrase comedy. The suit of jests are comedians' stock gags as senseless and inappropriate as those of the old radio comics, done with a set intonation and probably a comic facial contortion to boot, which tickle the audience within an inch of their lives regardless of context or character. It's not hard to imagine Shakespeare's teeth-grinding rage when the Chekhovian delicacy of Twelfth Night is interrupted by a cry of, "Cannot you stay till I eat my porridge?" especially if it gets the biggest laugh of the night. Or if the realpolitik tensions of Julius Caesar are broken by the clown camply intoning, "Your beer is sour." Hamlet tells them to avoid such nonsense, to stay in the play itself and stay alive in the moment. And then he delivers his zinger. "For the warm clown cannot make a jest unless by chance, as the blind man catches a hare." This is a wonderful description of the greatest comedians at work, their ceaseless quest to be in the zone, the hot place of creativity, or of an actor like Mark Rylance. Mark's two great credos are stay in the room and stay in the moment, alive to the possibilities of each moment in collaboration with the other people in the room, the audience. "As a blind man catches a hare" is a peerless description of the actor's or any artist's twitching, attuned sensitivity to the movement of the world around him and his or her sudden ability to seize the full potential in the air. To say that this has nothing to do with Shakespeare is for me daft, and yet this material appears nowhere else but in the first quarto. I doubt also that Shakespeare patronised the melodramatic pulse of much of this version. He grew up watching touring companies, and their crudity was hardwired into his understanding of the theatre. Yes, he wanted to adapt and to grow those energies and to take them to an infinitely more complex, more strange and beautiful place. And yes, he lovingly satirized the crudity of this theatre with the players seen in Hamlet, with the nine worthies in Love's Labour's Lost, and most gloriously with the Pyramus and Thisbe shenanigans at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream. But the satire is always carried out with a profound affection and with a proper respect for the dignity of the amateur performer. Certainly, Pyramus and Thisbe would never have grown to be one of the most treasurable artifacts in British culture if it had been written with acidic mordancy. It's written with love. Much of the first quarto is rubbish, and 95% of our touring text is taken from the second quarto and the folio, but I very much doubt that Shakespeare was as crudely dismissive of the simple dramatic heart of the forms that created the first quarto as many of those who have attempted to explain him. Is Shakespeare best in a field? No, you'd be daft to contend that. But there is something about the open air which helps to make his language become concrete, his imagery become actual, And there is something about the shifting air and the light which changes with it, which can constantly throw new perspectives and new angles on the words and the stories. And nature is frequently a more profound illuminator than this year's fashionable director with his neurotic little thesis. But what has been most important about the touring for us at the Globe is that it has kept us honest. Theatres and the attention they attract have a collection of subtle and dangerous ways of distorting its practitioners from their original purpose. Self-importance is unavoidable in the theatre, and I'd be the last person to disclaim that. If I tried, my colleagues would snort with laughter. But a necessary self-importance, a robustness, if you will, can quickly get calcified into an institutional self-importance, a lack of humour, a lack of perspective, a disconnection from the actual making of theatre, and most terrifying of all, a disconnection from the audience. Many contemporary theatre institutions seem to be built to detach the makers and the artists from the fundamental processes of making and, more crucially, from the audience. Directors nervously hang around in lobbies during intervals, listening to the comments of the audience as if they're eavesdropping on Martians. The stage door is now too far from the front door, and there is something dangerous in that distance. Our small-scale tours are the unanswerable antidote to any such self-importance. If you're putting out chairs in a mud-sludged field, if you're improvising tickets to create an Insta box office from a book of raffle tickets, if you're dismantling a set as the rain pours down on you, it's very hard to take yourself too seriously, however hard you might try. We come into the theatre for the simple pleasure of giving joy and giving insight and honouring truth. It's very easy to get diverted from that. Another reason is probably contained in what I said at the start about risking the dignity of the institution. I think there was contained within that decision to go on the road a deliberate attempt not only to risk our dignity, but actually to lose it. Because if you can't risk your own dignity, you are more than a little lost as any sort of artistic institution. And if you can't happily give it away, then you're very lost as a theatre. There is something about doing this bare bones back of a van booth Shakespeare at that moment and onwards, which served as a happy two-fingered salute to all those who would build a moat around Shakespeare. Since the Globe had always been on the back end of the disdain from the snittier and the snobbier end of the Shakespeare industry in the UK, it seemed better, rather than to try and manoeuvre towards the sad world of upmarket boutique deadness, it seemed better to say, well, if you thought we were rough and populist and over-accessible before, just watch how much further we can go. There's an act of collective kidding within the world of Shakespeare that everyone is pro-accessibility and pro-openness and pro-internationalism. However, when many are presented with the reality of that openness, and that reality has been more persistently presented by the Globe than anywhere else within its 20 years of, crucially, 20 years of tickets at £5 catering to many millions of people. When the upper echelons, the high priests of the Shakespeare industry, are presented with the reality of what openness and accessibility mean, they often run screaming back to their internet forums or their closed shop conferences, burbling angrily about tourists and school children and the uneducated. There were supposedly learned essays written in books about our Globe to Globe Festival of 2012, which skirted pretty uneasily with racism and occasionally seemed to fall openly into it. And the vile poison written about our audiences on the internet and snorted about with infantile giggling in the senior common room not only has no truck with grown-up behaviour in the modern world, but would seem barbarically insular to Shakespeare himself. There is still a terrifying gatekeeper mentality within much of the Shakespeare world. It's not made manifest in force or in muscle, it's more of an insinuating remark here, a contemptuous nod there, or a witty put-down you laugh at, then later when you unpack its full prejudice, you recoil in shock. Taking Shakespeare on the road in the way that we have is the best way of flying far away from the deliberate exclusion which so delights the gatekeepers. So where are we now? Last year, we took a full and beautifully cast production of Midsummer Night's Dream on a large-scale tour of China and Russia, playing 12 weeks in venues from the Mariinsky in St. Petersburg to the NCPA in Beijing, and all done without a single penny of public subsidy. We took a small-scale production of King Lear, the first, we believe, starring a British black actor, the wonderful Joe Marcel, all over the UK and Europe, and then on for 3 months across America. We took a fresh tour of Much Ado, put together by a brilliant young director, Max Webster, all over the UK and Europe. And then, of course, there was Hamlet. Hamlet is the crowning glory of all of our touring ambitions. Having done one tour of Hamlet around much of the UK and Europe in 2011, then another around the UK and a lot of the US in 2012, we decided we might as well go the whole hog. So in an unprecedented theatrical adventure, we launched our tour on April the 23rd, 2014, and we were attempting within the 2 years through to the 23rd of April 2016 to visit every country in the world, all 204 without a mission. This journey already 85 countries down, and as I speak, as you said, it's going from Brazzaville, where it was last night. It's not going to Joburg, it's going to Kinshasa, which I didn't realize, but is only 7 minutes. You go from Brazzaville to Kinshasa across the river Congo, and it only takes you 7 minutes. So we go from Congo to DRC. This journey is already so rich with stories and events and legacies that it will require another 12 lectures to do any sort of justice, which you'll be grateful to hear. I'm not going to subject you with, but I'll sketch in a few tiny quick details from the journey so far. The day after our Globe performance, when we opened, following the fashion of the original comedians of England, we all went down to Tower Bridge and we climbed on board a tall ship helmed by taciturn Danish Captain Haddock looky-likeys, which ferried us down the Thames and across an astonishingly still and silent North Sea to our first date in Amsterdam. Several weeks later, I visit the company in Kiev on the night before their elections, the first elections after the revolution. We're playing at a beautiful old arsenal built by Peter the Great, and there's a feverish excitement in the venue. It turns out that the entirety of the incoming political class have decided that they have to be at Hamlet that night. We watch thrilled as first the mayor of Kiev turns up, then the Minister of Culture, then all of the heroes of the Maidan Square Revolution, culminating in the man mountain that is Vladimir Klitschko, the heavyweight champion boxer of the world, and then following him, Poroshenko turns up with the entirety of his family. So we have the entirety of the people who are going to be elected into the government the next day. Pride and a sense of new belonging and optimism for the future sweep through the venue like an electric storm. At the United Nations, we're the first company who've been invited to play within the building itself, and we rather farcically play to 150 ambassadors, all behind desks, and all for some yet to be discovered reasons surrounding Kim Cattrall. It's not the easiest show we play. In Quito, Ecuador, the riot police in a beautiful square with an incredible, gorgeous white theatre all along one side of the square with a sort of balcony where you expect someone to appear and announce the revolution. The riot police coming out to deal with the audience who tried to get in who haven't got tickets. Something that's occurred actually about 5 or 6 times around the world. In Lima, Peru, in one of the most stunning theatres I've ever been in, a beautiful cream and golds, a sort of mix of native architecture and Spanish architecture. The company coming out at the top of the show and just saying, you know, we're the Globe Company and we're here to do Hamlet, and being smacked and slammed by a 2.5 minute volley of applause and screaming before the show had even begun. Playing in the courtyard of Prague Castle, a place where for centuries traitors were executed in one corner, old kings were incarcerated in another, and uncertain kings fled along the battlements as ghosts seemed to seep out of the stone walls and merge with the actors of the play. Playing to 4,000 people in Khartoum in Sudan. Playing in front of the point where the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean meet in Djibouti. Literally playing on the ocean with the crisscrossing waves plashing down in the background. In St. Kitts, an elderly lady at the front of the audience intoning after Polonius is killed. Finally, somebody dying. In Rwanda, the audience talking about what revenge means to them after their recent history, and what tragedy means when you're constantly stumbling over the bones of your own people, still badly buried in the earth. And in one of my most touching moments, most recently when I was out with the company, playing in Hargeisa in Somaliland, a small independent republic in the north of Somalia, a town which had not seen a play of any sort for 23 years. Our trip here was permanently galvanized by a slight sense of danger. Everywhere we traveled, we drive around in Land Cruisers with blackened windows, flanked by pickup trucks full of boy soldiers carrying AK-47s, which is not like your normal #1 tour. We played in a hotel ballroom to about 600 Somalis who, during the fifth act, simply get up out of their seats at the back and walk down to the front, not wanting to miss a moment of the sword fight or of the death of the prince. They just crowd round like it's a car accident or something. They then give a great roar of a standing ovation, and once that has played itself out, sit back down and look forward, cross their arms, and sit there in silent and excited anticipation. They want more. The empty space in front of them has briefly been filled with nonsense and insight and planks and passions, and they don't want it to end. They want that space to be filled again. All of these fragments play out as vivid memories from the last 11 months, with many more astonishing moments and future memories still to occur, we hope. We know that we're astonishingly grateful to a company who are holding themselves and the show steady through the most amazing variety of experiences. The trip is rich with feelings and joys and insights and colours and laughs to a degree which shouldn't really be permitted. And we know that joining them for brief visits, as we do, is simultaneously thrilling and heartbreaking to a degree which is hard to endure. Thrilling to join them, heartbreaking to depart. In November, I joined them for a brief jaunt in South America. I did Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. I flew there from Moscow, where I've been with Midsummer Night's Dream, and I flew on from Peru to Los Angeles to join the King Lear Company. Before I went, I had a long chat with one of my daughters, who had just finished Jack Kerouac's On the Road. Her fresh as a daisy enchantment with that book, with its sugar rush thrill at the excitement of being alive and in the moment and on the move, reminded me of my own feverish infatuation with that book at the same age, and of my desire to live in some way like Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty. And then I realized that what we were doing was the same, or similar, only maybe just a little bit better. The same rapture at the world, its glories and its sorrows, the same restless desire to savor, or in beat speak, to dig, the details and the panorama, and yet for us the privilege of being able to give something back each night, and something mighty, our beloved Hamlet, with his unique capacity to break hearts and to open minds. So the hares that Shakespeare set running 400 years ago still run, and year on year run wilder and happily run further and wider. Long may they continue to do so. Thank you.